He stood at the window of the South Tower in the early morning, watching the city wake beneath him. From the 44th floor of the World Trade Center South Tower, Rick Rescorla could see the streets filling, the bridges humming with traffic, the river carrying its usual line of ferries. For him, the height was never comforting. It was a reminder of how helpless people became inside a skyscraper when danger struck. That was why he kept an emergency radio on his desk, why he insisted on evacuation drills even when employees grumbled, and why he walked the floors every morning before most people even arrived. He believed the tower was a target, and he believed he had a duty to prepare the thousands who depended on him. He had lived through enough danger to trust his instincts. Born in Cornwall and hardened early by military service, he had fought in Vietnam with the U.S. Army 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, where he had led men through battles that left little room for hesitation. When he later moved into corporate security work for Morgan Stanley, he brought the same intensity with him. After the 1993 bombing shook the towers, he became convinced that the next attack would come from the air. Many dismissed the idea as impossible, but he kept planning, drilling, and demanding that people learn the fastest routes to the stairwells. On the morning of September 11th, the office was settling into its usual rhythm. Phones rang, printers hummed, and the floors carried the calm routine of a normal Tuesday. Rick was in his office when a thunderous impact shook the building. The blast came from the north, followed by a violent tremor that rattled ceiling tiles and sent papers sliding from desks. People rushed to windows, confused by rising smoke from the other tower. The announcement system instructed everyone to remain at their desks, but Rick grabbed his bullhorn and ignored it. He had no interest in waiting for further instructions. He had rehearsed this moment for years. He stepped into the hall and ordered the evacuation to begin immediately. His voice carried through the corridors, crisp and steady, cutting through the panic that threatened to build. He moved from floor to floor, directing employees toward the stairwell doors, reminding them that they knew the route, that they had practiced it, and that they could make it out if they followed the plan. Some were frozen in place, shaking or crying as they tried to understand what had happened. Rick placed a hand on their shoulders and guided them forward. Inside the stairwells, the descent felt endless. Thousands of people filtered down the narrow flights, pressed shoulder to shoulder, listening to the distant rumble of fire and metal shifting above. Rick kept moving, trading floors with his deputies, encouraging anyone who faltered, pushing the lines to keep walking. He used the bullhorn when voices began rising in fear, speaking to them as if they were soldiers under his command. Every few floors he broke into quiet singing, old marching songs from his military days, not to entertain, but to steady the tempo of their movement. Outside the tower, first responders were already pouring into the plaza. Sirens echoed between the buildings, and debris drifted through the air like ash. The impact on the North Tower had left a gaping wound that released a continuous plume of smoke. As evacuees emerged from the South Tower's doors, many stared upward, stunned by the scale of the destruction. Rick did not let them linger. He directed them away from the building, herding them toward safer ground near Battery Park, where the company had practiced gathering during previous drills. When the last large wave of employees reached the street, several of Rick's colleagues urged him to leave with them. He refused. Too many people were still inside. Some were employees, some were visitors, and some were simply strangers trapped in elevators or on unfamiliar floors. Rick turned back toward the tower, bullhorn in hand, disappearing into the flow of firefighters racing against time. They tried to stop him, warning him that conditions were deteriorating quickly. He knew it, but he could not walk away while people remained above. Inside, the stairwells were becoming thicker with smoke. The heat rose with every floor, and the air trembled with the strain of the upper stories. Rick climbed as others continued downward, passing groups who recognized him and begged him to go with them. He kept moving, convinced he could help guide more people out, before the situation collapsed entirely. Those who made it to safety later said that seeing him climbing upward gave them the courage to keep descending. At 9:03 a.m., the second plane struck the South Tower, sending a violent shock through the structure. The blast roared through the floors above Rick's position, unleashing fire and debris that sealed off stairwells and trapped hundreds. The impact severed communication lines and plunged entire sections of the tower into chaos. Witnesses outside saw the fireball erupt along the building's face, and the city's alarms rose to a level no evacuation plan had ever imagined. In the minutes that followed, Rick continued his attempts to move people toward accessible routes, using whatever paths remained open. But the damage above him had compromised the tower's integrity, and the heat made survival nearly impossible on the floors closest to the impact zone. Among those who had already escaped, word began to spread that Rick had gone back inside a second time and had not returned. Some searched the crowds, hoping he had simply been separated, but no one had seen him since he re-entered the tower. At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed. The structure gave way in a sudden, catastrophic failure that sent millions of tons of steel and concrete cascading downward. A massive cloud surged across lower Manhattan, turning day into a choking gray darkness. The sound overwhelmed everything: sirens, shouting, even the wind. For those who had been guided out by Rick's drills, the shock was mixed with the dawning realization that he had not been among them. In the aftermath, survivors told investigators and reporters the same story. Rick Rescorla's planning had saved them. Without his evacuation routes, his drills, and his refusal to wait for official instructions, the death toll inside the tower would have been far higher. More than 2,700 employees of Morgan Stanley and its affiliates escaped because he had insisted on preparation. His widow later confirmed that he had called her after the first impact, telling her he was getting people out and that she should not worry. It was his last message. As rescue operations continued at Ground Zero, those who knew him spoke of his calm, his discipline, and his conviction that leadership meant action, not comfort. His military record had shown he was willing to risk his life for others, but the scale of his final act went beyond anything he had ever been asked to do. He had walked back into a burning skyscraper because he could not leave people behind. Today, his legacy is measured not only in medals or memorials, but in the thousands of lives he saved through preparation, resolve, and an unshakable sense of duty. For those he guided out of the tower, his voice in the stairwell stayed with them long after the smoke cleared. It was the sound of a man who understood fear but refused to surrender to it, who believed that leadership during catastrophe meant stepping toward the danger, not away from it. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.